You talk about the dangers of replacing nature with genetic engineering. What do you mean by that?
Well, we know for years that when you genetically engineer an organism and release it in the environment, we have no way today to recall it. So we have contaminated the genetic gene pool of soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, etc. And we can see that in 100 years or 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, as long as that species exists, we may have the output, the impact of the genetic engineering that was done in laboratories in the 90s, because it's a self-propagating corruption of the gene pool. Now, we've only gotten about a dozen genetically engineered crops that have been commercialized, and that means that this corruption has happened with those, plus to a smaller extent, those that have been put out for field trials that may have crossed with wild relatives, uh, out of the field trial. But now genetic engineering is so cheap and easy. It costs $169 to get a do-it-yourself kit at Amazon. Um, Companies can, if they have a laboratory for the price of dinner, can create a new organism. They're targeting everything with DNA. And there's no real government oversight in most of the world. And the United States has terrible oversight on the gene edited GMOs. They've been convinced that it's safe and predictable, where in fact the most common result is surprise side effects. So if you imagine for a moment that we release insects and grasses and trees and flowers and livestock as new organisms that have never, were not the products of the billions of years of evolution, but instead the products of laboratory creations whose number one most common result is surprise side effects, we end up with a situation where we can be replacing ecosystems, replacing nature. Now, when you introduce just one invasive species into an area, we all have our favorite examples of an invasive species wreaking havoc. My favorite is rabbits. They introduced 24 rabbits on Christmas Day in Australia in 1859 to make visitors from the UK more comfortable so they could hunt rabbits. Well, rabbits multiply like rabbits. And without natural predators, by the 1920s, they estimated over 10 billion rabbits were inhabiting and eating Australia. When you think about genetic engineering, you're not introducing one new organism. You're introducing potentially a replacement of all or many organisms in an ecosystem with unpredicted side effects. So they become like genetic time bombs, and you don't even know what can happen in the next generation if the GMO changes or if it starts to interact with a new other organism or the weather or a disease. And unfortunately, there's no recall. So future generations may not inherit the products of the billions of years of evolution. They may not see nature as it was created, that we inherited. And they may be cursing us for all future generations, dealing with the rabbits and the kudzu, but not just that, basically potentially catastrophic, even cataclysmic outcomes of this unpredictable process that's prone to collateral damage and side effects. So we now are looking at the possibility of permanently replacing nature with a self-propagating corrupted gene pool.
What's the new responsibility we all have given the new technology of genetic engineering?
If we now have the capacity to damage all living beings and all future generations, that's a new capacity. Maybe we haven't had this in the past, except perhaps by blowing everything up with a nuclear winter. But other than that, even climate change will have an arc and a restoration period. But with species, the only thing that lasts longer than corruption of a gene pool is extinction. So we are looking at an impact of this generation that will be felt on this planet forever, as long as the species exists, as long as the ecosystems exist. So then we're invited to take a new role, a new relationship with nature, to protect all living beings and all future generations. Something that previous generations could never have done because there hadn't been the technology to do such widespread long-term harm. So it requires a kind of a expanded understanding of our role with nature and our choices today to protect her and to protect future generations. So we can pick our excuse. We can pick the things that we love, whether it's monarch butterflies or the microbiome or trees or our children. But it's all part of one ecosystem that we need to protect. And this is the responsibility of this generation. Right now, it's not 10 years or 20 years, because if we don't stop it, there could be hundreds of thousands of new GMOs introduced in this generation.
What's the importance of the microbiome, and why is it important to protect it from genetic engineering?
You may have been one of the people who were very concerned when we heard about the Chinese scientist in collaboration with US scientists who genetically engineered twins. You know, that hits very home to all of us. And there's an ethical, a moral question. You might have been outraged to see pictures of suffering animals that have been genetically engineered that couldn't stand, that were, just horrible pictures of pigs and cows and whatnot. Higher organisms are more connected to our hearts, to our sense of morality. You probably don't suffer much when you think about bacteria being genetically engineered, or viruses or fungus. But from an environmental and even a health standpoint, there's greater risk there. They can absolutely travel around the planet. They can create diseases. They can damage the microbiome of our bodies, of the soil, of the biosphere, of all ecosystems. We know now more than ever before in Western science and Western medicine that the microbiome is like another organ. It supports our digestion, it supports detoxification, and it supports our immune system. And to such an extent that I remember interviewing Kiran Krishnan, an expert in the microbiome, and he pointed out that about 80% of all diseases have their origin either creating or exacerbating the disease by disturbances in the microbiome. To underscore the point, you can take a sick animal, rat, mouse, take some of its feces and implant it in a healthy rodent and create the disease. You think the disease may be related to something completely different than the gut microbiome, of the animal, but it can be transferred. Similarly, you can take the microbiome of a healthy animal and transplant it and create health in a sick animal. And we've done this, they've done that with human beings. You can transfer traits like thin or fat or relation, or how you metabolize sugar. It's all as if programmed. The microbiome are like the micro Jedi army that works on our behalf, and we don't understand it. When a woman has breast cancer, there's a change in the microbiome in the breast. A new strain comes in, and when they killed the strain thinking it was part of the problem, it allowed the tumor to spread. It's actually helping. There's a microbiome that happens in the brain with Alzheimer's. There's the microbiome in the brain that helps intelligence. I was told by Dietrich Klinghardt that when you kill off the microbiome in the brain, the intelligence goes down. There's a microbiome change in the birth canal that inoculates the newborn. It's very intelligent. It's it's an amazing untapped resource. I mean, it's tapped in the sense it's constantly available to us, but we don't understand it. We do know that bacteria can swap genes. So you can have one bacteria with a gene and all of a sudden it meets and they have a party and then they all leave with the bacteria that helps them survive. We know that it can spread around the planet. Now imagine that it's genetically engineered with a trait that you think it's good for the soil, but you don't realize its impact on the gut. Or you think it's good for the gut, but you don't realize its impact in the biosphere. It's playing with fire in such a way that we could collapse ecosystems. So our focus at the Institute for Responsible Technology is to protect against the replacement of nature, but we're focusing primarily now on the microbiome.
What's the worst case scenario for genetically engineering microbes?
Well, I can give 2 or 3 examples of genetically engineering the microbes or the viruses. First is the pandemic. I'm not going to discuss the origins of COVID-19. We don't have to make our point. We can look at H5N1 avian flu. It's estimated to be up to 24 times more fatal than COVID-19. The fatality rate has been rated as high as 60% by the World Health Organization, 53%, 52%. Some put it more like 25%, but it is way more dangerous, more deadly than the COVID-19 virus. Now, in order to get this brand of avian flu, you have to be around these birds for a long time. It doesn't pass easily between humans. Some genetic engineers made an airborne version of it. Now, this is absolutely crazy to create an airborne version so it can pass through breath. They used ferrets. It could pass from one ferret to another that had no contact. Now, it never escaped the lab, but to even create it, knowing about the possibility of lab escapes, there have been over 1,000 lab accidents in secure labs. They found live smallpox in a cardboard box in a storage area in a lab when it was only supposed to be in 2 labs in the world forever, one in Siberia and one, I think, in Virginia. They have shipped accidentally live anthrax. They have caused spills. It is so unsecure in these secure labs to create these genetically engineered versions of potentially pandemic pathogens is crazy. So that's one scenario, massive death. Okay, you said worst case scenario. Here's another one. In our film, Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle, which you can watch at protectnaturenow.com, we introduce an experiment that was almost a cataclysm. Not just a catastrophe, a cataclysm. Well-meaning scientists. The scientists are not the enemies. They do what scientists do. They tinker. They try to use their toolkit to improve something. So these well-meaning scientists genetically engineered a type of bacteria called Klebsiella planticola. It's found in the root structure of every plant in all terrestrial systems that they've checked. I think it helps break down that cellulose. They engineered it so that it would turn plant matter as it's broken down into alcohol. And the idea was to distribute it to farmers who normally burn the crop residues on their field. Instead, they'd gather it and put it into large buckets or drums and add the bacteria. And then in a couple of weeks, they open the spigot and they'd have alcohol to run their tractors or to sell off farm. And the nutrient-rich sludge was to be spread on the fields as fertilizer. Now, this bacterium passed all of the regulatory requirements of the EPA in the early 90s, and they were going to do an experiment to see how far it would spread. They were going to release it outdoors, and it was scheduled for a particular date. 2 weeks before that date, a graduate student, Oregon State University, I believe, PhD student, who was doing research on the genetically engineered microbe, not because it was required, not because the developers asked it. He asked them to do research because he needed to do something for his PhD research. So he took that nutrient-rich sludge, mixed it with soil, put it in a tray, and planted wheat seeds compared to controls. Came into his lab. All of the wheat seeds on the nutrient-rich sludge were slime. They had all died. He first thought he had made a mistake. It turns out that the bacteria in the nutrient-rich sludge was still active, and it turned the roots and then the plants to alcohol, killing it. His advisor, Elaine Ingham, brought this information to the world, told the UN about it, because if it were to spread and displace its non-GMO counterpart, it would be destroying the root systems everywhere it went. And how far would it go? She was told by people at the EPA that they had conducted a secret experiment, which they disavow knowledge of to this day, where they actually released genetically engineered bacteria in a field in Louisiana. And a year later, that had found that it had traveled 11 miles, and then another growing season, then another growing season. Eventually, the EPA stopped testing, but some EPA employees continued to take samples and test for it. And eventually, they found it everywhere on the planet that they tested. So now imagine if the Klebsiella planticola transformed the natural version, which is found everywhere on Earth, to one that kills terrestrial plants. As you'll see in the film, Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle at protectnaturenow.com, Elaine Ingham said the natural consequence could be the end of terrestrial plants. This is a cataclysm. There's another version of genetically engineered bacteria, which we'll talk about. You can see it, which could have theoretically changed weather patterns, maybe permanently. And these are just 3 examples: H5N1, Klebsiella planticola, Pseudomonas syringae. These are just 3 examples that could have widespread, devastating consequences. So you ask the worst case scenario, I would say massive death and ecosystem collapse. We're talking existential threat. It should come of no surprise to people that GMOs present an existential threat, especially when you start broadcasting the technology and changing so many things all at once without even doing the simple safety studies. But even if they did the most in-depth safety studies they could possibly do, research shows that when you release a GMO, whether it's a microbe or a plant, it can change in subsequent generations. Traits that you've engineered can be switched off. Other problems you never anticipated can appear. It can transfer genetic material to other species. They have a gene drive, which is engineered to pass on to all future generations the trait that you're creating. So they want to wipe out rats on an island. They want to wipe out certain mosquitoes. What if that trait disappears, as it can, or transfers to another insect or animal, wiping them out, or maybe making a more virulent, more dangerous, more disease-prone, or more resistant mosquito accidentally? So you can pretty much make up any nightmare scenario that you want, and it could be plausible. So protecting against genetic engineering the microbiome is essential activity for this generation.
If someone's eating organic and avoiding GMOs, and they've noticed great changes in their life, and they're feeling better. What's next?
Well, this comes down to the responsibility of this generation. Amy Hart and I did a film called Secret Ingredients, where we talked about switching to organic, and kids with autism were no longer on the spectrum. Infertile couples had babies. I mean, dramatic changes. And these were not just one-offs. We have evidence. We've surveyed over 3,000 people. I've asked thousands at live talks. Similar results. So if you are in one of those categories, you understand certain laws of nature. You're aware, and you have the clarity and energy supported by an organic diet. Now it's time to do the activism appropriate to your life. Now, I'm an anti-GMO activist. I'm protecting the gene pool. I think that that's something that many, many people can be involved in, even as a click and send non-GMO revolutionary. Even by going to protectnaturenow.com, signing up and sharing everything that you get, going to our Facebook page for the Institute for Responsible Technology and reposting everything. That's a way to very easily and simply move the needle. For others, we have more in-depth knowledge, so there's deeper training. There's the opportunity to learn to speak on it. We have activist opportunities to implement laws and policies and resolutions around the world. We have a global plan. So I think at this time, there's a calling for this generation to step into a more responsible role. And I want to be careful to say, I don't think everyone in the world should all of a sudden become a anti-GMO activist, and their main focus is to protect the microbiome and all other living beings. I understand that people have their own calling, but I encourage people to follow that, to move forward in that, to think huge. Thinking big is so last century. That we have huge problems, we need huge responses, and some people wait around for permission. So if you need to hear it, you have permission. You have permission to step into the highest version of yourself, to step into a partnership with nature, to step into a partnership with perhaps the reason you're here. And while you're at it, no matter what you're doing, please lend some help to our emerging movement, because the future of humanity and all living beings is dependent. So whether it's sharing information, making a regular recurring donation, telling friends about it, or even signing up at protectnaturenow.com so that you can be aware, so that we call forth to send a letter or send a petition, sign a petition, send a note to your congressman or senator, and we will be asking, and it will be pre-written so you don't have to do anything unless you want to customize it. We will make it easy and entertaining and fun and planet saving. So especially for those that understand the laws of nature regarding health and diet and have the effect of that in their lives, I'm calling on you to become part of the spiritual activism, the Earth's activism, and to step into your highest version now. So I'm encouraging people to say yes to what they may have been partially saying yes to their whole lives.
What's the current state of affairs around GMOs in the United States and around the world?
I have been working to educate consumers about the health dangers of GMOs for 25 years. This is my 25th anniversary. And when I started, no other nonprofit organization was focused at all on the health dangers. There was resistance to my taking a position on that. It was like, we can't argue that. That's Scientists can argue that, but we can't argue that because somehow the Monsanto framing that, it's like, don't worry your pretty little head about it. It's not something for the average consumer to understand. We understand it and we tell you it's safe. Well, I wrote a book, Seeds of Deception, and then another book, Genetic Roulette, and gave 1,000 lectures in 45 countries and 1,000 interviews and trained 1,500 people to speak and organized 10,000 activists in North America through the Institute for Responsible Technology. And we and others, oftentimes originally inspired by us through our messaging, got the word out about the health dangers. So what is outstanding right now is that 48% of the world's population, where they did the surveys, believe that GMOs can lead to ill health, GMO foods. 51% of Americans. Now, that's more people than we need in order to have a profound influence on the marketplace. Because if Nestle's or General Mills or any of the major food companies has a brand on the shelf and a competitor has a non-GMO brand of the same cookie or bread or whatever, they're going to get more sales. And the GMO that's being used by Nabisco or whatever doesn't add any value to consumers. It's generally allows the crop to be sprayed by Roundup or produce a toxin that can kill insects and might damage our gut and immune system. So there is a scrambling now by major and minor food companies to eliminate GMOs so they too can put the non-GMO label on the product. And this was our design. So we are enormously successful at this point. And the biotech industry is totally aware. So they got together years ago and decided to try something, a little sleight of hand, saying, okay, we're going to come up with a new generation of GMOs. Let's not call it GMOs. Let's call it gene editing, and let's describe it as breeding. And let's describe it as safe, predictable, and natural. And so they pummeled through lobbying and whatnot, elected officials and regulatory agencies with this disinformation campaign, using the same sentences they used to describe the original genetic engineering, which everyone knows is not predictable and not safe. But fortunately, even though most people using gene editing, and it's been used hundreds of thousands of times, if not millions of times in laboratories all over the world, very few of the labs do the evaluation of the product that they've engineered to see what level of damage has occurred, what level of mistakes have occurred. But those that have were shocked in many cases to find that the predictable outcome was not actually what happened, but there were far more problems than they anticipated because many of the scientists believed the rhetoric of Monsanto and others, expected it to be free of mistakes. And when they finally looked at it, like they did in a study on human embryos, they described it as chromosomal mayhem. Chromosomal mayhem. It is a disaster. It is a disaster. There are so many things that can go wrong. Mutations at the point where it's cut, mutations all around, even a study that showed epigenetic changes, changes in gene expression that lasted to all 10 generations of rats that they tested, which means we make a change in the genome and its expression. Not even if you didn't change the sequence somewhere, what genes are expressed, how they're expressed can change and be inherited and passed on to future generations. So we know that this is absolutely dangerous, and yet the biotech industry has convinced governments and is trying to push other governments like the EU and the UK to say that gene editing is safe, natural, predictive, and it should be treated like breeding with no regulatory oversight. So no one today in the EPA, USDA, or FDA needs to put any attention on a gene-edited mushroom. It wasn't approved. It was ignored, officially ignored by all the different regulatory agencies because it doesn't fit into their category. So the current state of GMOs in the world is that we have succeeded in moving the marketplace on genetically engineered foods, and now we need to change the laws, not just consumer behavior, but establish laws and a general understanding in the population, in popular culture, in school curriculums, in scientific societies, in institutional review boards that approve GMO research at schools. We need to get a profoundly universal understanding that we need to lock this technology down and not let it corrupt in a self-propagating way the gene pool that is so precious and necessary for our very existence.
Why should we eat organic? Does that guarantee that we're not eating genetically modified foods? And why is it really important for our health?
I used to say eat non-GMO, and if you can, eat organic because you get all the benefits of organic. Now I say eat organic, and if you can't, at least eat non-GMO. It turns out Roundup herbicide, which is sprayed on most GMOs, was being remarketed or repurposed by Monsanto to use as a desiccant, a drying agent, primarily on grains and beans. So they'd spray it on the fields of these living crops, and it would ultimately kill them. It would dry them down. It would force a rapid maturation or ripening of the grains, and it would kill all the plants around it so that the farmers would have a clean field for the following year. So if you look at oats, which happen to be kind of open to the air when it's sprayed, the Roundup gets absorbed into the oats. So you have higher levels of Roundup in oats than in Roundup Ready soy, which might have been sprayed weeks before harvest. So it turns out that you definitely don't want to be eating things that have high levels of Roundup residues. I can go into it. Perhaps we'll have a question for that, but it's something you want to avoid. Now, organic does not allow the use of Roundup or atrazine or other dangerous toxic synthetic chemicals. It also doesn't allow the use of GMOs. It doesn't guarantee their absence because drift happens, contamination happens, but it's the best system we have, and it's highly recommended. If you can't eat organic, go to responsibletechnology.org, find out which products are GMO. We have a non-GMO shopping guide, and also sign up to get the report on the Roundup residues. So you'll know that wheat and oats and chickpeas and lentils are so high that those should be avoided unless it's organic. And you'll understand which may have less Roundup residues and are not GMO, so that they could be in a category where it's a bit safer to eat if it's not organic. So responsibletechnology.org. If you can't eat organic, figure out how to avoid GMOs and high residues of Roundup.
And so you mentioned we might have another question about Roundup, and we do. And if you can, tell us a little bit more about what it is, how it affects us, why it's in the news, why there are lawsuits about it, why you've said it's one of the most serious health issues that's driving up disease rates.
Well, Roundup appears to damage the foundation of health in many ways. So I'm going to give you some different categories. Microbiome, gut bacteria. It is an antibiotic. It kills bacteria. It kills the beneficial bacteria, not the nasty stuff. A recent study found that one of the ways that it kills bacteria is by blocking a particular pathway that's needed, the shikimate pathway. And not only does this kill bacteria, changing their diversity, turning the bacterial balance so that it promotes disease, but also the shikimate pathway is used to create the building blocks of serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, neurotransmitters that are necessary. They're the happy chemicals. They help block anxiety and insomnia and pain and Parkinson's and other things. So, in just the way it works with the microbiome, it can promote most diseases. It also grabs onto minerals, making them unavailable. Mineral deficiency can lead to hundreds of diseases, according to some, and minerals are needed in order for certain biochemical pathways to actually function. So if the mineral isn't there, all the workers are on strike. They're just sitting there waiting for the mineral to show up, and then they can go. That's what happens in many cases when Roundup or its chief poison glyphosate is circulating in our bodies. It also creates leaky gut, which is linked to so many diseases that a Harvard scientist wrote an article saying leaky gut is the source of all disease. And glyphosate causes leaky gut. So that, and inflammation and allergies and autoimmune disease all through that, and cancer and heart disease, all linked to leaky gut. It causes lack of communication between cells. It's called the gap junctions, drops that, which is linked to cancer. It causes the ability of the body to detox to be impaired, both at the level of the liver and on the level of the cell. We can go into the details, the NRF2, the P450 cytochrome pathway, but I think I'll just keep it jargon-free. It can damage the DNA, which also can lead to cancer. It was described as a probable human cancer carcinogen, class 2A carcinogen, by the World Health Organization's cancer body. It damages the mitochondria. The mitochondrial health is based on longevity. It's the basis, for, according to some, for longevity, to be cancer-free, for energy, to fight brain fog, and so many other things, because the mitochondria are the energy centers. There's some cells that have as many as 5,000 mitochondria in them because they need to be active, and it destroys the mitochondria. According to, you can see it in microscopes, told to me by Zach Bush, because he's seen it and his team has demonstrated it. Breaks the structure of the cell down, the actin. It also can lead to birth defects that can be passed on from generation. And it also has shown the epigenetic changes where a pregnant rat was injected with Roundup. I think it was mice actually. And it didn't affect the pregnant mouse or their offspring, but it affected their offspring and then their offspring. So the great-grandchildren, 90% of them had serious diseases. Prostate problems, kidney problems, reproductive problems. Many died in childbirth, either the pups or the mothers. In the great-grandchildren generation, so it passes it on. It can impair digestion. And I'm just getting started. So you can see the foundation from the gut microbiome, the use of minerals, the neurotransmitters. It can be a hormone disruptor. It can create non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. In fact, if you look at more than 30 diseases in the United States, they seem to have a bump up when Roundup was started to be sprayed on GMO soy and corn. And the rise of those diseases is coincidentally, I don't think so, parallel with the rise and the increase of Roundup. I mean, if you look at autism rates for 6-year-olds, the R factor, the correlation is 0.997. If it were a 1, it would be a perfect correlation. It's devastatingly tight. Now, correlation doesn't prove causation, but when we understand how Roundup and GMOs also, because that also is impacted, can cause these diseases. When we see humans and livestock and pets all getting better from these or similar diseases when they switch to non-GMO or organic food. When we see the animal feeding studies where they're force feed GMOs or Roundup to animals get sick or have precursors to these diseases or similar, we have enough data to suggest, more than suggest, that this correlation that we're seeing with diabetes and heart disease and senile dementia and deaths from senility and deaths from Alzheimer's and deaths from Parkinson's and deaths from intestinal infection and irritable bowel and all sorts of cancers and anxiety and insomnia and even suicide by overdose and schizophrenia and all these things all of these things we believe are related, promoted by Roundup and the GMOs. And so when we say avoid Roundup, we really mean it. And I think the best education tool is the film Secret Ingredients that I did with Amy Hart. Go to secretingredientsmovie.com. And this is what people can use to convince their relatives. People came up to me and said, I was able to finally convince my wife or my husband or my daughter or my parents because I showed them your film. They didn't want to hear it from me after so many years, but when I showed them the film, they became more vigilant than me. So this is the tool to use to convince those. And you can go and watch it with them if you can do that, or just send them, buy them a rental or send them a link, something like that.
Tell us more about the research of the biotech industry. Why do you say their research is rigged?
In the recent trial where people who got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after using Monsanto's Roundup, the plaintiffs won all the cases so far, were awarded huge sums of money by the jury, later taken down by the judges. One of the reasons why the juries were so angry at Monsanto was the revelations of how they did all the evil things that we think they do. But it was there in black and white because so many memos came out, over 1 million pages. Millions of pages were made available, and a whole team was sorting through it. And by and large, it verified what I knew and what those of us in my position know. But it brought us new information that we had never seen before. So there was an example of a typical Monsanto study. Typical Monsanto, but it's one of my favorites because it's so graphic. They wanted to they had to see the absorbability of Roundup on human skin as part of their EPA report. So they took cadaver skin, dead body skin, put Roundup on, checked it, 10% absorption. Oops, more than 3 times the allowable level. They did not tell the EPA, probably illegal. Instead, they took human skin and they baked it in an oven. Now, think about cooking meat. Think about overcooking meat, how it becomes tough. But that for some reason wasn't good enough for them. They probably checked it and found it wasn't holding up. So then they took that overcooked human skin and froze it. Then they applied the Roundup. Didn't get absorbed much. They reported that to the EPA without telling them that they had baked and frozen the human skin before they applied the Roundup. So they could give a real number based on a fake rigged research. I can give example after example on how they rig their research using the wrong tools, the wrong statistics, the wrong control group. It's so blatant. I mean, what I just described is blatant. There's a long trail of blatant rigging research. They hire a scientist, Dr. Parry, the expert in determining whether it's their glyphosate is going to be causing changes in the DNA, which could lead to cancer. He reviewed the research and said it appears that it does. So he wrote a report. They were supposed to give that report to the EPA, buried it. Thank you, Dr. Parry. You don't have to work for us anymore. released him from contract, and decided to ghostwrite a review paper that came to the opposite conclusion. Paid scientists, so they put their name on it, released that. It became the basis of review by the EPA and other regulatory agencies, determining that glyphosate didn't cause cancer. It was a ghost-written false report. So you can see. And the last example I'll give, which is also one of my favorites, is their assumptions. Their scientific assumptions are bizarre, and yet they're repeated by regulatory agencies. I've talked to people in regulatory agencies, and it's so unscientific what they say. It's like, are you guys on a payroll or just not using your brain? So in Australia and New Zealand, Monsanto tried to get high lysine corn approved to feed to pigs. And it created a protein that was new, and they claimed that there needed to be no studies on the protein because it was already safely eaten by humans because it was produced in soil. And we have soil residues in our food. So obviously, if we're eating food, we're being exposed to the protein, so it's safe. So Dr. Jack Heinemann, a scientist from New Zealand who I know, decided to call their bluff and figured, okay, what's the average amount of corn an American male eats? And if it's Monsanto's high lysine corn, how much of that protein would be in their diet? How much of that protein is produced in soil? How much soil would they have to eat in order to have the same amount that they would get from just the corn? They'd have to eat 22,000 pounds of soil per second throughout the day. A dump truck of soil every second in order to get the equivalent amount. This is Monsanto science. This is checkbook science. This is not real science.
Tell us about the threats to scientists and the stifling of research on the health impacts of glyphosate and GMOs.
I was one of the first people to cast a very big spotlight on scientists who've been beaten up by Monsanto's system. And the first chapter of my book, Seeds of Deception, is about Dr. Arpad Pusztai. And it's a fun read, and it's tragic. He was the world's leading scientist in his field. He worked at a top nutritional research lab in Scotland, the Rowan Institute in Aberdeen. He received a grant from the UK government, over 27 competitors, to come up with a protocol for how to test for GMO safety. And he took potatoes that were genetically engineered to produce an insecticide, and he ran the potatoes through the protocols that he had created and found that the rats that he fed them to had dramatic damage. They had potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system in just 10 days. And he went public with his concerns. He was invited to speak on a TV show, and with permission from his director, he was quoted for 2.5 minutes. All hell broke loose in Europe, where it was played. It was huge controversy. Over 700 articles were written about GMO safety within the UK alone. But he was quickly fired from his job after 35 years, silenced with threats of a lawsuit. They withdrew the data. His house was burglarized and all of his papers were stolen. They came up with an anti-Arpad Pusztai campaign, claiming he had made mistakes in his research, which was not true. He ended up having a heart attack. His friends wouldn't. He had to finish his contract at the Rowan Institute, but he couldn't do anything. So he would go out to eat in the cafeteria. No one would sit with him. So he'd just eat with his wife in his office. It was absolute terrible 7 months. But eventually he was invited to speak before Parliament, got his data back. his information is published, and it shows that the process of genetic engineering generically was responsible for those dangers. The same process used to create all the GMOs, or most of them. And his treatment became a poster child, basically saying, if you dare to speak out about GMOs, even in your own research, this is the way you'll be treated. So many scientists have told me that hundreds of other scientists refuse to do work on GMOs or their associated chemicals because they don't want to be treated this way. And I have examples over and over again of scientists who have been threatened, forced out, lost tenure, lost research grants, have had petitions of other scientists aimed at them, largely based on misinformation, lies, disinformation that circulated that damaged their reputation. And so it becomes a standard knee-jerk reaction. And this was described even in Nature, the journal Nature, as a standard knee-jerk reaction of the industry to attack scientists, even personally.
You mentioned the Monsanto Roundup trials. Can you tell us more about those? What's the current status and more about the rulings so far?
Well, to give you a background, Bayer purchased Monsanto, the Bayer aspirin company, and the Monsanto executives said, oh, there's no problem with these non-Hodgkin's lymphoma plaintiffs. We'll set aside $260 million, and that should cover it. The first trial, the jury awarded Lee Johnson $295 million. And then there was a third trial where the punitive damages alone were $2 billion. Now, the judges reduced them, but it demonstrated that Monsanto was losing the trials. Juries were furious. Real science was presented. There were even scientists in the jury. And Monsanto knew they were in trouble. So they've offered a settlement of $11-12 billion for about 125,000 plaintiffs. And they have to negotiate them with certain law firms who represent a bunch, and some have accepted and some haven't. But the pushback on Bayer has been huge by the shareholders, and certainly the stock price, which dropped by close to 50%. So they paid $63 billion for Monsanto and lost nearly that much, again, in their stock valuation. There's stockholders suing. The chairman had to step down. And the lawsuits brought out to the world, because they had high coverage, the dangers of Roundup. So many countries, many school systems, parks and recreation, garden centers are eliminating Roundup from either using it or selling it. And so it's kind of a shock heard around the world. And from my side, it was great to see all of the documentation showing in black and white how Monsanto came after me. I was mentioned in the trial, in the last one. They had a memo about me, and they subject line was whack-a-mole. You know, like here they said, Jeffrey's at it again, writing about the health dangers of GMOs to children. And I had quoted the UK Royal Society, the Canadian Royal Society, the EPA, all these different groups in my article. And it was pointed out by Brent Wisner, the lead attorney, who also mentioned it during the closing arguments, that instead of looking at evidence that children might be harmed, they just set their pseudo-scientists to attack me rather than treat it seriously. So these were things that got the jury quite upset and also verified what we've been knowing for a long time. But it was really fun seeing it in black and white.
What are all the benefits to GMOs according to the industry? And is any of it true?
Well, the biotech industry will jump on anything that's current and claim that GMOs are the answer. So climate change, pandemic, a certain disease in agriculture, they wanted to genetically engineer cows without horns so they wouldn't hurt each other if they were packed into factory farms and you wouldn't have to cut the horns off. They want to genetically engineer out the mothering instinct from livestock so that you can take the children away. They want to, well, there's malaria or there's Zika. Let's genetically engineer mosquitoes. Let's change the rate of growth of salmon so it goes to market more quickly. It's like Lego mentality, but that's not how the world works. Now, there are benefits to genetic engineering. Human gene therapy, in some cases, won't kill you. Sometimes it did. Some of the research and experiments did actually cause kids to have leukemia. But theoretically, if you take one person and you make a change and you correct a defective gene and it's not inheritable, you're not changing the nature of nature, you may save a life. You may be able to produce chemicals in a closed system from genetically engineering microorganisms that you can't produce economically or at all. Now, unfortunately, that could lead to some very negative consequences if that microbe changes, if it gets out. There was an L-tryptophan supplement that was genetically engineered by bacteria, and the process almost certainly created the contaminants that caused an epidemic, killing about 100 Americans and causing 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick. They don't check for those things. They don't acknowledge and honor the things that can go wrong. But theoretically, it might have a positive impact. Using it for research is amazing. You can understand so much more about the DNA. But where I draw the line is outdoor release or release into the food supply of GMOs or their products. Now, if their products are released outdoors, have you studied? Like if it's not something that can be that can reproduce, how dangerous is it? Well, the L-tryptophan was an example. And then anything that's being used in containment needs to be highly secure because you have to anticipate that it will escape or it might escape. And what will happen if you've genetically engineered yeast to produce CBD or ashwagandha or vanilla or saffron flavor? What if that escapes and now it's producing the same thing in your gut microbiome or in the oceans or in the deserts? So it's like if you look at things with narrow blinders, there's all sorts of benefits. If you take the blinders off, you have to be so careful. And I'm not against genetic engineering per se. Just to be clear, there are ways it can be used for research and in limited ways to produce things, but it has to be in the context of great safety.
Are there any studies on animals that have been fed GMO versus non-GMO foods specifically?
There are several studies that show that the animal's structure and function is different. So much so that a peer-reviewed article by Dr. Jack Heinemann and Dr. Turya Trevik declared that these were different organisms. Animals that were fed GMOs are actually different organisms, and they enumerated all the different ways. There was a 2-year study on rats from Dr. Seralini, and he found that rats that were fed genetically engineered Roundup-ready corn had multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. Those that were fed the Roundup had the same things, and those were fed the Roundup that had been sprayed on the corn that had been sprayed with Roundup had the same thing. So it was both Roundup and the GMOs that caused problems. We have high rates of mortality, damaged immune systems, potentially precancerous cell growth, tumors, cancer, activation of the immune system, changes in enzymes in the organs, damage to the intestinal walls, so many different areas. Basically, every system and every organ that's been studied typically shows some change. It's not always clear if that change is going to damage the animal because most of the animal feeding studies are either 90 days or 28 days. And I remember talking to a former Monsanto scientist, and he said that he was aware that when they fed rats genetically engineered corn in 90 days, there was significant damage to the rats. So instead of withdrawing the corn, they rewrote the study to hide the effects. And he was aware that in Southern Africa, including South Africa, many people use corn as a staple 3 times a day. And that the amount of corn fed to the rats, which is typically maximum for Monsanto studies of 33%, was well below the amount of corn eaten by humans, not just for 90 days, but for their whole lives. So he was concerned that the rat study was a very, very dangerous marker for what might be happening in South Africa and those countries. I remember speaking to a veterinarian in the US who had a client in South Africa, and he was feeding all, as they all do in the farm, the corn grown on the farm was used as the basis for their meals 3 times a day. He was growing 100% GMO corn, and he had a huge death rate, a huge sickness rate, had to have 20% more people hired. He said there was 60 people hired instead of the 50 that he needed, and that once or twice a month he would notice that he would be talking to an employee and their eyes would move in different directions than each other. They'd lose the parallel tracking, and he knew that within 1 or 2 days they would be dead. So this was like shocking news, and he didn't know why. No one knew why. But the veterinarian told him to switch to non-GMO corn, and when he switched non-GMO corn for the animals, who got better from their problems, the workers got better too, suggesting that the concern by the Monsanto scientists about the high intake of genetically engineered corn was very real and extremely serious.
What is CRISPR technology, and is this a safer, more natural form of genetically modifying organisms?
CRISPR is the poster child for the biotech industry for gene editing. A Nobel Prize was given to the 2 developers of it. It has been touted as safe and predictable. It is not. On our website, you can read more than a dozen studies showing a variety of changes that occur as a result of the process that are unpredictable and potentially damaging. Changes that can be inherited, both genome changes as well as epigenetic changes, up to at least 10 generations. They found that when they used, so I can go through those problems, how they can add, let me do it this way. With gene editing, you have 2 major components. You have a scissors and you have a guide. The guide looks for a particular sequence in the DNA and then tells the scissor cut here. Now, if you're looking for a short sequence in the DNA, that sequence can repeat dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times. So it may cut in non-target locations. It also may tell the scissors to cut if it's similar enough. So it doesn't have to be an exact match. So you can have cutting all over the place. The cutting may happen exactly where you want it, in addition to other places, but then you're relying on the self-repair mechanism of the gene, of the cell, to attach it together. At that point, you don't have any control. At that point, there can be mutations. They can pick up DNA from the petri dish, which has happened, goat DNA, cow DNA put into mice, bacterial DNA put into cows, completely out of the control of the experimenter. It can cause duplication and chromosomal mayhem. They call it natural. They call it more precise. But actually, there are aspects to it that are more dangerous, where once it's in there, you may put it in a system, it does the cutting, you may do an assessment and then put it on the shelf for a year before you decide which cell line to grow. That whole year, it's still cutting, it's still active. So by the time you use it, it may have done more damage, more change to the DNA than the changes that you had tested for. And usually they don't test, their testing is pretty superficial anyway. And there's the typical way that you used to genetically engineer is to use bacterial infection or a gene gun, which will shoot genes into a plate of cells. You typically can use that to get the gene editing equipment into the cell. So that also causes additional damage. And then for plants, for example, once you've created the cell, you have to use tissue culture to create the plant, which is a form of cloning. And that introduces hundreds or thousands of additional mutations. So if you narrow your focus and say, if it approaches just the area that you're supposed to, and it does the cut and it doesn't happen to have any side effects, oh, that's predictable. But everything in the context of actually how it's used makes it extremely unpredictable and potentially dangerous.
Are GMOs in all high fructose corn syrup? What other processed foods are they in?
The high fructose corn syrup made in the United States, as far as we know, last time I checked, all of it was from genetically engineered corn. They have these huge wet mills that take vast amounts of corn. They produce it into all sorts of fractionated products, and high fructose corn syrup is one of them. And a lot of different corn derivatives are there also. To get high fructose corn syrup that's non-GMO typically has to be imported, or at least it did a few years ago. You end up with corn derivatives in a lot of processed foods, soy derivatives in a lot of processed foods, cottonseed oil, canola oil, all of those plus alfalfa are used as animal feed. So you have animals that have been fed GMOs. So sugar beets create sugar. Most of the sugar in the United States, over 50%, comes from beets, not sugarcane, not the same beets you buy to eat in the supermarket or the farmer's market. Those are not genetically engineered. They're specific white sugar beets. So it's throughout our food supply, often in highly processed forms. So that's why I say if something is in a box or a can, probably 9 out of 10 times there's a GMO in there.
Are there any other products aside from Roundup that the biotech or chemical industry makes that concerns you?
I'm concerned about the synthetic chemicals in general, because I came into this activism and this advocacy and education effort focused on GMOs. I look at the associated chemicals to the GMOs. Roundup is the most common one sprayed on Roundup Ready soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa. There's also Liberty Link products that use Liberty, which is glufosinate, similar to glyphosate, the chief poison in Roundup. Glufosinate is linked to birth defects, brain damage in offspring, and all sorts of other nasty things. So I'm concerned about that too. So I say, rather than listing all of these, atrazine and all these others, when you go organic, within 3 days, your level of glyphosate can drop by 70%. Within a couple of weeks, many of the chemicals that are in your body, in your bloodstream, drop. So I would say eating organic is extremely important, especially for parents, and including prior to conception. So be organic for at least 2 weeks before conceiving, and ideally longer. And then throughout pregnancy and lactation, particularly important because of the birth defect and the formation and all the ways that chemical impacts can be amplified at that level at that time.
Does Impossible Burger have GMO ingredients? Why did they choose to use this ingredient?
Friends don't let friends eat the Impossible Burger. Please share that on your social media. Impossible Burger not only uses genetically engineered soy for its protein, probably genetically engineered derived vitamins to fortify it, but the blood red dye or look to make it look like meat comes from genetically engineered yeast. They took a gene from the roots of soybeans, put it into the yeast to create a protein that was never part of the human food supply. It may be an allergen or a toxin or an anti-nutrient, could be devastating. In the process of doing it, they did not purify that protein. They just scooped up what the yeast produced, which had 46 other non-characterized proteins. So now you have all of these new proteins in this burger just to make it look red like blood. And we've understand that many people get sick. I've heard that. I haven't verified it myself. I haven't tasted one. But there is a group gathering the information from people who had adverse reactions. I say don't bother testing your body. Just avoid it. When you use yeast as a genetically engineered base, it can create things that you didn't plan for. Back in the 90s, they genetically engineered yeast and it increased a carcinogen by up to 200 times. And the authors said if you genetically engineer yeast, you have to be particularly careful. When L-tryptophan was produced from genetically engineered bacteria, the process created, we believe, the contaminants that caused about 100 people to die and about 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick and be permanently disabled. So the technology is prone to side effects. Friends don't let friends eat the Impossible Burger.
What's the status of GMO fish and what are your concerns around this?
There was just a declaration recently by the courts that the approval process for the salmon that was approved by the FDA was illegal. And yet I've also heard recently that AquaBounty, the company that made the fish, were planning to release the salmon in the US market in 2021. I'm needing to check to see if the court order blocks the release. I can talk for a long time about the salmon and how it might lead to cancer or allergies or other problems, how the research was rigged to avoid finding problems, and even then indicated significant changes in the salmon itself that would be huge alarms going off for people, but they only used 6 fish in their research so that the statistical power was so small they could say even a 50% increase was not statistically significant in the items that they were looking at. It's been a disaster for science. A similar fast-growing salmon was created by Canadian scientists and tested in tanks. They tested the frankenfish, the natural fish, separately and together. When there was sufficient food, everyone was fine. When they reduced the food, these fast-growing, genetically engineered salmon, who were voraciously hungry, became aggressive and cannibalistic, attacked their frankenfish counterparts, attacked the natural ones, and the ultimate result was when they reduced the amount of food, it caused population crashes or extinctions in the tanks. So if these fish that AquaBounty is creating, which with a similar technology, if they were to escape in the ocean, we might see a collapse of salmon. We might see aggressive packs of dangerous salmon going and killing off other fish to support their voracious eating. If there was a survival advantage for them over the natural, we would see a replacement of natural salmon. And if the salmon turned out to be dangerous for health, then we would see an elimination of salmon as a food source. And because salmon are part of an ecosystem where there's other fish that eat salmon and salmon eat other fish, it could have devastating consequences.
Are there other chemicals such as Agent Orange that are of concern that are being sprayed throughout the world?
Agent Orange has two major components, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, I believe. But 2,4-D is an in-use herbicide. It is an older herbicide. It is toxic. The process of creating it can create dioxin, which is one of the more toxic chemicals ever discovered. And because Roundup and glyphosate, its chief poison, have been used so much, the weeds are outsmarting Monsanto and becoming resistant the same way that if you overuse antibiotics, the bacteria outsmart it and mutate. So there's been an increase in these other herbicides, and now they have GMO crops that are tolerant to 2,4-D. Now they also have GMO crops that are tolerant to dicamba, another dangerous herbicide. They released the dicamba resistant soy and cotton, and dicamba can volatilize. It can be sprayed and float up into the air, travel miles, and then come down and damage crops. And it's damaged millions of acres. So there's been lawsuits. One lawsuit with a peach farmer. Peach farm was awarded $265 million. The evidence showed that Monsanto and BASF that created this knew in advance that it would cause damage and planned for it. Because if your neighbor is spraying dicamba for dicamba-resistant soybeans or cotton, and your field gets destroyed or damaged, the next year you're going to have to buy the dicamba-resistant because you're forced to. So it was a marketing effort. Let's destroy some fields in order to stimulate sales. So the jury was furious, and of the $265 million, $250 million of it was punitive damages for the way these guys behaved. But because dicamba is so problematic, and they're looking to try and pull back the approval, they did some kind of pulling back of the approval, it's going to allow more 2,4-D, which could increase its use by maybe 25-fold, according to Dr. Charles Benbrook, maybe more. So that's going to be in the food supply, that's going to be in our system, and that's going to do damage.
Why was it important for you to come back and speak here at the Real Truth About Health conference?
You know, every time I get a email from you guys, if I see that I'm a speaker, it's very convenient. I just send it off to my team and say, use this, because you ask some great questions, and you give time for the answers, and you have a big platform to get this information out. Going to the conferences in person is always great because I get to meet buddies and make new friends. And it's one of the great bonuses of being on a speaker circuit is to hang out with the other speakers, because they turn out to be very dedicated, often fanatics like me, balanced fanatics, and great sources of information and inspiration. And of course, meeting people in the audience is always fantastic, eating with them and sharing stories. So there's the quality of going when it's in person, and there's also getting the word out, because you guys are dedicated to creating a free platform for people to get this information, which is awesome. So hats off to you. And I encourage people that if they watch a segment that they enjoy, to please post it, share it, tweet about it, because you bring together some very powerful speakers with great knowledge and in a format that's easily digested. The currency of the internet is video. And I would like to encourage people to not only watch the speakers that they get emails for on a regular basis that have interest, that have a topic that interests them, but to immediately share anything and to write down what it was that caused you to share it. Like, I really like the part about boom. I like the part where Jeffrey said this, or whoa, I had never thought of this. To get people halfway into the conversation, what to look for, and even if you're paying a lot of attention, indicate for the longer clips where it is in at 2 minutes and 15 seconds. I was blown away by this. Now, as I'm saying this, people listening know if you got something from a friend that said at 2 minutes and 15 seconds, I was blown away by what genetically engineered microbes could do to the earth. It is so much better than share, So be a marketer. The Real Truth About Health has given you the content. Become an educator. Become a servant of society with this in your hand, and that is called a leader. So this gives you a chance to be a leader, and thank you for that.
Well, thank you for that feedback and those recommendations. Our hats are off to you for all of your meaningful work, which means so much to all of us. So thank you. Thanks for your time today, Jeffrey. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Be well. Take care.
Safe eating.